Well, I'm glad y'all are here. Is that speaker working in the back? Can anybody in the back hear? I watched a ventriloquist here not too long ago, and he was talking along, and he said there was a guy that was there signing for the deaf people. He said, can you imagine bringing deaf people to a ventriloquist show? Anyway, he said, pretty soon he made me mad. So he just started making the dummy talk, but he didn't say anything. And people are going. Sometimes I have a feeling that's what you're doing when I'm trying to talk. Watching the dummy speak. Do with that what you want. All right. Reading from Matthew, 18th chapter. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and said, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Calling a little child forward, he had him stand among them, and then he said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never get into the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and whoever receives a little child like this in my name receives me. If anyone causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung about his neck and he was drowned in the bottom of the sea." Commentators don't necessarily agree on who the little ones are. They don't know if Jesus' references to children, small-aged children, or if he was relating or referencing people who had been newly saved from their sins. In either case, don't do it. Okay. How terrible it will be for the world because it causes people to sin. Temptations to sin are bound to happen, but how terrible it will be for the person who causes someone to sin. So if your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to enter into life injured and crippled than to have 2 hands or 2 feet to be thrown into eternal fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into hellfire. See that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you, their angels in heaven always see the face of my Father in heaven. Some people believe that there is the scripture that gives context to a guardian angel. So think about that for this week as you're going about your responsibility. See to it that you do not despise the little one, for I tell you that For the Son of Man came to seek to save those which are lost. What do you think? If a man had 100 sheep, and one of them strays, he leaves the 99 in the hills and goes to look for the ones that have strayed, doesn't he? If he finds it, truly I tell you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 that haven't strayed. In the same way, it is not the will of your Father in heaven that one of these little ones should be lost. If your brother sins against you, go and confront him while the 2 of you are alone. Interesting. Jesus is being very specific on how to handle conflict between 2 individuals. And the first step is to talk to him. I received a telephone call one time, and the person was wanting to tell me about the sin of another person. I needed to know that. I forget I'm hooked up to a microphone. I listened for a little while, and finally I said, "You need to talk to that individual, not be talking to me. Talking to me is not going to solve the problem." And so people love to broadcast other people's sins. Let's just put it that way. I don't think I was well received, but that's the way it is. Okay. So, in some way, it is not the will of your Father that one of these, I should have read that, but if he doesn't listen, then take one or two others with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If, however, he ignores them, tell it to the congregation. If he also ignores the congregation, regard him as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I tell you, whatever you prohibit on earth will be prohibited in heaven, and whatsoever you permit on earth will be permitted in heaven. Furthermore, truly I tell you that if 2 of you agree on earth about anything you request, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I among them. Then Jesus came up and asked him, Lord, how many times may my brother sin against me and I have to forgive him? 7 times? That is why the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. Well, Peter here is listening to Jesus speak to the people, and Jesus is talking about how to resolve some issues between people and how to solve some of those problems. He was also concerned about offending little children and of such. And he says, it's going to happen that offenses come, but woe unto him by whom those offenses come. And you and I need to be careful that we're not the originators of the offenses that come to people that would cause them to stumble or to lose out in their Christian walk. So Peter comes to Jesus and he says to Jesus, how many times do I have? No, I don't know what he said. He said, how many times do I have to forgive my brother? 7 times? Now, the significance to that is the Jewish leadership at that particular time said 3 times was enough. So here's my question. How many times have someone sinned against you?
You don't count.
You don't count? That's good. We'll get around to that, bring that up later in the Sunday school class. One writer said, it's highly unlikely that somebody's going to sin against you 7 times in the first place. But what Jesus say? Jesus says, no, not 7, Peter, 70 times 7. Now, was Jesus referring to 490 and then 491, I can nail him? Okay?
No, he's thinking you'll forget by that time.
Yeah. Jesus kind of dealing a little bit in hyperbole here, where he's exaggerating to make his point. Okay? And so he's saying, no, Peter, let's jump that number way up to it's unbelievably high. And then he has a parable. What's the rule of parables?
An earthly story with a heavenly meaning.
It's an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. And what can we take from a parable?
A lesson.
A lesson. 1. Okay? And today's parable is a good example of why we take 1 lesson from it. All right? All right. What was the parable about? The parable was about a king who called his subjects into account. So he has these people that are working for him, and he does an audit of their work assignments. And when he did an audit, he found one that came up a little short. Only 10,000 talents. That's a very large number. Now, I find it fascinating to me that when the commentators go to write, they say, well, that's about this much money and this much. Well, I'm sorry, but inflation has hit twice since then. Okay? And so that is not a good way to reference it. If we take the second servant that we're going to refer to here, we have a way to kind of determine that. And he had 100 pence, which is 100 denarii, but a denarii in the Roman day was approximately a day's wage. So when we deal with that, we can say, okay, a day's wage for 100 days, we got a feeling for how much that is. Now, 100 days' wages for you would be different than it would be for her, and for her, and for her, and for him, okay? But I don't know what 100,000 talents or 10,000 talents would be. You can tell me it's $40 million, and that don't mean many beans to me, okay? Some people believe that Jesus was exaggerating here again to make the point. It was an extremely large amount, okay? So what happened? He was called into account, he was short, and what was the judgment that was made by the king?
No, this one was forgiven. This son was.
No and no. Now I'm having, huh?
Throw him away in prison
No.
and his family.
Oh, that's
He
right.
didn't like
Yeah,
that
his
answer.
cousins.
Supposed to be sold.
He told him to sell him.
Yeah.
Not only sell him, but to sell his wife and sell his children and to pay the bill. Did did all of that sum equal the amount of 10,000 talents? No.
No.
Okay. What happened to the servant at that point?
Jail.
No, he didn't go to jail.
He pleaded forgiveness.
He pleaded forgiveness. And how did he plead for forgiveness? He flopped himself on the ground, he prostrated himself, and if you will look the background meaning of some of the words, it was he acted like a dog that was licking his shoes to show how much prostration he was giving evidence to, and he begged for time so that he could pay it all. Could he pay it all? Probably not. Probably not. What happened then?
Then the guy forgave him.
Then the king said, the king had compassion on him and loosed him and forgave him of his debt. All right. Do we have a nice story going so far? Yes, we do. All right. Now, what happened to the servant that was just forgiven of his debt? He went out and he found a friend. And that friend owed him a humongous amount of money called 100 pence or 100 days of wages. And what did he say? He said, you pay me what you owe me. And how did he tell him that?
He grabbed him around the throat.
Yes, he grabbed him around the throat and throttled him.
Yeah, took him.
And he says, pay me what you owe. What did the fellow say? Be patient with me, and I will pay you all. And what did the first servant say? Pay me what you owe, or I'll throw you in prison. He said, can't pay, so he threw him in prison. Back in that day, it was common for a debtor's prison to exist. And if you couldn't pay your debts, whoever you owed it to could cause you to be placed into prison. Now, here's my question to you. How much of the debt can you pay while you're in prison?
None.
Zip. Okay. And I found it interesting. I don't know. I was reading after Adam Clark, his commentary, and I think he wrote in the 1700s, if I remember right. Okay. One of the things he was petitioning at that particular point in time was that the nation of Britain would reconsider their law of allowing debtor prisons to exist, because he says it serves no purpose to get the debt paid or to help anybody on either side of the fence. All right. So, whoa, yeah.
I think it's like a ransom thing. You know, right now people are kidnapping people, you know what I mean, and they're raising ransom that they, you know, that they probably couldn't come up with on their own.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, if they get $6 billion or whatever, you know what I mean, from a government for their release, why? I think that's what this is referring to, kind of. Because it's the family has to come up with the, you know what I mean, the
Someone else.
somebody else has to
Yeah.
come up with the
Mm-hmm.
money.
Right. Back in that day, the government was smart enough not to be involved in that, but that's a side subject that we don't wish to participate in. All right. So they threw him in prison, and then what happened?
Well, his friends went to the original leader who had forgiven that particular man who threw him in
We'll call
prison.
servant one and servant two.
Yes.
Go ahead.
So servant one, the first one, who had thrown him into prison, the friends of the servant two went back to talk to the original Lord
Yeah.
to let him know what was happening. And then he set out his actually the lesson for the parable.
And the king then called the servant one into court and said, what?
You're done, Sonny.
No pay.
Shouldn't you have treated servant two like I treated you? Okay. And then I find it interesting. Then the king became wroth or angry. And what did he do? What did the king do? The king sent the guy to the tormentors until he paid the whole debt. What's the rule of parables? There is one meaning for the parable. What is the one meaning for this parable?
To teach forgiveness.
To teach forgiveness. That's one way of saying it. And if you are forgiven, you should be forgiving as well. Okay? The tail end of the scripture says, if you expect God to forgive you, you need to be forgiving as well. And if you do not forgive, you will not be forgiven. Okay? What are some of the thoughts? Well, let me finish up the parable issue. One thought on the parable. The thought is, to be forgiven, you must be forgiving. That is the lesson. All right. Something that always bothers me about this parable is what the king does. What does the king do? He calls the guy in and says, you failed the audit and you owe me lots of money and you will pay up. And then the king has compassion and he forgives. And then he unforgives. Okay? And then the king restores the punishment that he had in the first place. That bothers me. What do we call that in the legal system?
Probation.
Double jeopardy. Right. You cannot be convicted of the same crime twice unless it's in another jurisdiction. Okay? But if you commit something in the state of Ohio and you go to the state of Michigan and do the same thing, Michigan can get you and so can the state of Ohio. That's not double jeopardy. But if you're accused of murder in Hancock County and you are acquitted, you cannot be convicted of that murder again. Okay? So, that's the part that bothers me about this. So, back to my comment. There is one lesson to be learned out of a parable, and you can't push it to make the parable fit all situations. However, we can draw some thoughts out of this parable that are applicable to our lives, that are beneficial to us. And one of them would be, how many times can we forgive? It should be limitless. Okay? And that's kind of a reference back to what Peter was saying to Jesus, do I just do it 7 times? Now, another thing that we can learn from it is Peter asked a good question for his culture and his time. And who did he ask it of? He asked it of Jesus. He went with a question to the right source to get a good answer. He didn't go to just anyone, all right? Now, what did the first servant? He pleaded for patience so he could pay all. What do we learn about that? What does that imply about that servant?
He's legalistic.
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily.
He was willing to try.
He confessed he owed it.
Yes, he confessed he owed it. Could he pay? No. So did he just downright lie to the king?
No, he might have been able to pay whatever he could.
Okay. Was he trying to manipulate the king? I'm surprised you didn't come up with that one. He was trying to wrangle him so he could get out of whatever situation he was in so that he could go on doing whatever he was doing. Now, it's interesting to me to note that in the parable, there's no mention of whether he did anything illegal or not. Was he just slothful in his labors that he allowed money to get away from him, or did he embezzle? There's no indication of either way there. Okay? Now, when we look at servant 1 versus servant 2, contrast them and give me some thoughts.
Both servants asked for forgiveness and more time.
Yes.
Servant 2's offenses were relatively minor compared to servant 1's offenses.
Mm-hmm. And if we was to bring that into today's thought process, what would you say that would sort of imply to us? My offenses are sort of trivial compared to yours.
And those were just misdemeanors. The others were felony.
Okay. All right.
Getting so legalistic.
It is very common for us to say the offenses that I bring are minimal compared to what you are guilty of. And what would we learn from that is that regardless of how trivial or how extensive, both need to be forgiven. Okay? What else would we learn from this? You're going to make me check my notes, aren't you? A little bit of money can soon cause men to take advantage. All right? I'll tell you a story that I'm not proud of. I got married at a young age. The girl I married was a teenager. And I still hold it against her. I needed money to go on a honeymoon. And so I took a check down to Nye Grocery in Alveda because the bank would not cash my check. I had just put money in it and they had to have it there 7 to 14 days before they could give me my own money back. So I went down to Nye's Grocery and the nice Catholic gentleman gave me cash for my check. I didn't have enough money. My brother was home, and I don't know why, but he was, and I borrowed some money from him. I asked him for so much money. He gave me that much money and $10 more. I went on my honeymoon. We did an extensive, elaborate honeymoon. We went to Niagara Falls and came back through Canada and back home, and I started driving truck the following Monday morning for Sandy's dad. Helped build the bridge that goes over Sandusky Bay, in case you want to know what I was hauling stone for, hauling it out of the Marblehead Quarry. That's a whole different set of stories. All right. Came time to pay back my money. I paid back the amount I asked for and kept the other $10. I am not proud of that, but for some reason, $10 got in the road of my judgment. People, when it's time to settle up for estates and things of that, it's amazing how much trivial amounts of money has caused family divisions and difficulties, and how that has even come into the church and caused divisions that way. Just a little bit of money can cause that. One of the things we note is that the other servants that was observing what was going on felt bad because of the treatment that servant 1 gave to servant 2. And what did they do about it? They understood the hardships that was going on and rendered, I guess what I should say is, it made them feel bad because of what had taken place. And you and I should feel bad when others are taken advantage of and mistreated. This parable also demonstrates how cruel men can be. We have recent histories of World War II. We can go to all kinds of cultures and peoples, and it isn't just one group of people. It is sinful man that causes cruelty to animals and people all over. And this parable is again an example of it. It also gives us, if it is legal, is it right? Not necessarily. The servant one did what was legal, but he did not treat servant two right. Forgiven servant was not removed from being a servant. That was something one of the commentators said. He was forgiven of the debt that he owed, but he was not removed from servanthood. Okay? Just an interesting thought there. We are expected to show mercy. Jesus said, the king said to the servant one is, if I forgive you, you should have forgiven. You are expected to show mercy to others. And one of the phrases that came out of that was, not being merciful is a great wickedness. If you and I have a chance and opportunity to show mercy, it is incumbent upon us as Christians to show mercy. And if it's a choice between being rigid and right or merciful, choose merciful. God will be more honored in your actions if you do that. We are responsible for our own sin and not another's sins, and we must be forgiven. We must forgive if we are to be forgiven. Now, any other comments along that line? Other thoughts that come to mind?
Well, my thought was going back to an old lesson of what you do to other people. Jesus said you're actually doing to me also.
Mm-hmm.
So in the end, it was the Lord or the Lord of that estate or the Lord in heaven, whichever one you want to
Mm-hmm.
think the parable to be, who ended up having to give a punishment. And in this case, our punishment was, as you talked about the other lessons, he either goes to paradise or Hades.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of brought all three lessons together.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts?
God will not be mocked, and I agree with what you just said. I saw the king as our king, our creator, and we got, he was so forgiving. He came to the earth, Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
He forgave us, and yet we are not forgiving.
And one of the things it would be is we will all be called someday to give an account.
Mm-hmm.
And you won't be standing there talking for your friend, and your friend won't be standing there talking for you. You will be on your own giving an account of what you did and what opportunities you had in this area of spirituality. Other thoughts?
Can I take from this that Jesus came and paid the debt for my sin that I could never pay?
Well, I don't know if you could take it from this parable, but that is true. That is a true statement. Yeah. It also gives indication of how multitudinous is our wickedness and how much we have been forgiven. And what people do to us, even though they might hate us and do bad things to us, it is still minimal compared to what Jesus forgives us for. Yes.
Well, it also leaves you wondering, in many murder cases and so forth, where does your mercy supposed to stop? And that's a quandary, I think, that many people have.
Where's your mercy supposed to stop?
Well, if somebody is, accused of murder or something,
Yeah.
I don't know whether it stops, but at what point do you,
All right, let's do an example. Joe Dibley here just committed murder. Okay? What are we supposed to do to him? What?
Hold him accountable for his actions.
How?
Well, by a fair trial.
Fair trial? Okay. And what does a fair trial do? Fair trial brings out all the evidence, or should bring out all the evidence. And what should the jury do? The jury should rule in favor of the truth. Should. Okay. And then by the jury's fair trial, Joe is deemed guilty. What should happen?
A consequence.
A consequence, all right?
So what if he don't feel guilty or plead guilty?
What way would he plead then? He would plead guilty, or
Not guilty.
he'd plead not guilty, you mean? Well, if he pleads not guilty, then he ought to be tried by a jury of peers, okay? And they should be determined whether he is guilty or not. And then what happens? The judge comes along and he signs the consequence, okay? What should the consequence be if Joe is guilty of murder? Well, you ought to have a variety of answers here.
Or it could be the Old Testament, the eye for the eye.
What if it's New Testament?
New Testament says a little different.
Something equal to the action.
Forgive him 490 times.
There you go. There you go.
What?
We can't hear the answers back here.
Well, they're muttering. That's part of the reason. And instead of talking, they're trying to get by without answering. Should Joe's life be taken as a consequence of him being guilty of murder?
According to the laws today, yes.
Not all of us.
All right. Go ahead.
I'm done.
Well, then my question to you is, according to this Bible, what is it?
Premeditated or not. It's the judge's decision.
I hear
He's
you.
supposed to look at the cases and decide what the punishment fits the crime.
All right. You guys are avoiding the question I'm trying to apply. Is capital punishment sanctioned by the New Testament?
I think it is a lot.
I think it is.
Sure.
I think it is.
We're supposed to abide by the law, aren't we? Of the land.
Yes. Yes.
The law of the land says capital punishment.
Which varies.
That is a part of it. Okay. That is a part of it. Because part of the scriptures say follow the law, and the law is part of your constitution. Okay. And you need to resolve that, and that kind of complicates it a little bit in some ways.
Every juror has to say he's guilty. If one says he isn't, then there's a different outcome.
I understand that, but we already made that determination that they all said he was guilty.
Right, right.
Okay.
Maybe the judge that does the research and finds out that Joe is mentally ill.
The judge doesn't do that research. The lawyer's job is to do that research.
They found that he's
Plead insanity.
People, it's a complicated issue.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you better be careful when you do a slam dunk on it. And it's easy to say, if you murder, you should have your life taken. That happens to be the side that I am on. But I'm also understanding that not everybody would necessarily agree with that position. Jesus said that he that hateth father or mother let him die the death. Well, he wasn't talking about backslapping him on the side of the head. Okay? So there's reference there where you can use to believe that capital punishment is permitted in the New Testament. You can also be of the position that that the New Testament is promoting mercy, and so you can put that into your thought process too. All right.
So you're saying each case is of its own?
Is what?
Is of its own?
Yes. Yes, that would be true. And the mental question that Eileen brought up would go into that consideration. Yes, that was also. All right, I want to, you guys have listened long enough here. When a person is caught in a wrong in ordinary life, he pleads not guilty, he is tried, he's convicted, and then he's punished. But in the realms of salvation, when he is convicted or is found out that he is wrong, if he admits his wrong and he confesses his sin, what happens? He is forgiven. So the ways of salvation are different than the ways of ordinary life. And remember, when we're dealing in things of celestial value, eternal value is a better way of saying that, we need to keep in mind that eternal things take place. And Jesus said very clearly, unless you forgive, you can't be forgiven. And so I would say to you and to me, let us examine not only what we are doing currently, but what we've done previously. And are we holding something unforgiven between you and someone else? If it is, it must be resolved before eternity. I recently talked to a fellow, and his wife's father had passed away. The father had been very harsh and cruel to the daughter, to the point of being abusive. But before he passed away, he asked for forgiveness. I told the fellow I'm glad he didn't carry that across the line of eternities to meet the judge of all the earth, because the judge of all the earth will do right. Be forgiving. And if you haven't been forgiven, you let that be the problem of the other person, but you be forgiving regardless of what their attitudes and actions are towards you. We are accountable for our sins, not for the sins of others. All right?
If you don't forgive somebody that's wronged you, I don't mean to death or whatever, but if you don't forgive them, you don't feel right.
Right?
Right? It's you carry
A grudge.
and that's not for a Christian.
That's exactly right. And in 1 John 1:9 it says, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Go be a forgiving people. Have a great week.